Hello and welcome to The Drill Down, where we drill down and expose cronyism and corruption in the federal government in Washington, D.C. The host of this program is normally Peter Schweizer. Peter is out of town this week, so I, the co-host, Eric Eggers, am here. And of course, hosting a program like this is such a monumental job. I could not begin to do it alone, but I'm very pleased to be joined by someone who can help us unpack and I think expose one of the biggest stories of the last, multiple decades. It is, in fact, mid-July, which means we are at the one-year anniversary of one of the biggest political events in modern history, July 13th, the assassination attempt of Donald J. Trump. One person who has doggedly exposed lots of things in that last year is Susan Crabtree. She's an award-winning investigative reporter for Real Clear Politics. She's also an author. She wrote a book with Jed McFadder exposing cronyism corruption in California. Susan, it's great to be with you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Eric. I'm exhausted from all of
I know it's been,
all the reporting over the week.
As you should be.
They surprised us. The
So,
Senate surprised us with a few, minor reports and details over the weekend. So there went my weekend. I was just, nose in the reports all day, but it was a gold mine. I know people think that it was a solemn event and it was a solemn event on Sunday. But it was like Christmas in July for me for this report to come out, especially the Rand Paul report, the Senate Homeland Security report, because it confirmed a lot of my reporting and provided more details.
And we're going to get into all the things. And I think the fact that it's even notable that the year anniversary of the assassination attempt with Donald Trump is when we finally begin to get some answers to the things that we have not known for some time. How did the Secret Service respond to its failures? We know more now about just how much they did fail, the Secret Service, in what led to, this first assassination attempt in 40 years of a president or former president. And we're going to talk about that because 1 year later, there are some things that we now know, thanks to you, and some things that we still don't know. 1 year later, we know that what happened on July 13th, Donald Trump was leading the polls in a very serious way. He triumphed over Joe Biden in that monumental debate. We know that the Biden campaign had internal polls showing Trump was poised to potentially win the election with up to 400 electoral votes. We know after this assassination attempt that Joe Biden stepped down 8 days later. I mean, it really was an insane July last year. It just seemed like everything was happening. We know that the Secret Service has admitted on this day a year ago to, quote, stunning lapses in planning and communication. We now know, thanks to Susan, we're going to talk about this in great detail, 6 agents were suspended due to failures that day, though the level of agent and length of suspension are shockingly low, so much so that the widow of the victim that day has called the Secret Service's actions a slap in the face. So, Susan, let's just start there. You said it was Christmas in July, this Senate report that came out. What can you tell us about the suspensions that the Secret Service decided to issue, and why are so many people reacting in such an alarming way because of it?
I think it's the classic, maxim that everybody's responsible, so no one's responsible, but we're obligated to, give some slaps on the wrist. So we're going to do this to the junior members of our team, of our security team that day, but not the supervisors that we're cozy with and that we're actually supposed to provide the experience and the oversight to compensate for the inexperience of some of the individuals that were charged with coming up with a plan and doing the advance work and the execution that day. It is alarming that we have 10 to 42 days of suspensions, but the 2 key supervisors on the Donald Trump detail, in fact, an inspector that was on the walkthrough, they are skating. And in fact, they got promotions, big promotions.
So just to be clear, and just to say that another way, and we're going to give some context to why what you just said is even more concerning and alarming. 6 agents in total were suspended. Their suspensions range from 10 days on the lower end to one agent was suspended for 42 days without pay, although those agents are not losing their pension, they're not losing their jobs. And as you noted, those are lower level agents, the people who were in charge, the people who helped oversee and execute the plan and signed off on the plan were not suspended, and in fact were promoted. And here's why this matters in a really big way, because there's still a lot of stuff that we don't know, but what we do know is that the job of the Secret Service on that day was a lot worse than we realized even in real time. When somebody takes a bullet, obviously there have been some failures, and there's been a lot of questions about the person who is taking those shots, Thomas Crooks. Did he act alone? There's some new reporting that suggests that maybe he didn't. The Washington Post has got some really interesting reporting about stuff we don't know, including like who's actually responsible for stopping Thomas Crooks, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit, including, hey, why has it taken a year for us to figure all these things out? But one of the things that we do now know, thanks to Susan's reporting, is that the Secret Service knew about threats of the Iranian assassination, of the possibility of Iranian assassination ahead of the event. We know Thomas Crooks was seen by numerous law enforcement officials beforehand. He was flagged as a suspicious person, and he was even seen as looking through a rangefinder before the shooting. But we know now that the Secret Service, and Susan, talk a little bit more about this. It's not just, hey, here's another event, and Donald Trump's been doing events, and there's been nothing of consequence. But we know that they were aware of the threat of assassination as sponsored by foreign power Iran for some time, and we now knew details about that. What can you tell us?
Yes. So, we all know that there was an Iranian threat that came out the week after the assassination attempt in Butler. So the news came out, broke that day, and then we later found out that there was an arrest. The FBI arrested an individual for plotting an assassination attempt in the United States against Donald Trump, and that individual had Iranian ties. So this idea that the Secret Service knew 10 days beforehand came out this weekend with the Senator Grassley's report. We knew that there was an Iranian threat, but we didn't know that the Secret Service top brass, including Kimberly Cheadle, the then director, and her number two, Ron Rowe, who then became the acting director when she left, we didn't know that they knew and were briefed on this Iranian threat. And if that's the case, why did the counter sniper, the first time that the Secret Service Trump campaign was given a counter sniper, even though they were pushing for that the whole time? And Sean Curran, the current director, was the chief, the boss of that detail. He was pushing back all the time. So why did they only drop the counter snipers in 2 days beforehand? That is ridiculous and absurd, because
and just to line up those, Susan, if we can, just to line up those timing on that really quickly, because you're saying, so we now know, and this is not something that we've known until this past weekend. So this is new information that, thanks to Senator Grassley and the Government Accountability Office, a year later, we now know that 10 days before the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, they released information that, hey, Iran is planning to do something. There's an individual who we know has got connections here. So the threat became much more real. So the Secret Service was aware of the threat of an Iranian-sponsored assassination attempt 10 days before someone actually took a shot at Donald Trump. And that puts the Trump campaign's request for additional assets in protection that were then denied by the Secret Service in a very different perspective, does it not?
Yes, I'll just to correct you a little bit. Trump campaign details. So it's Sean Curran. So Sean Curran is,
right.
Not the campaign itself, because they weren't. I don't
Sure.
know who was briefed. I don't think anyone was briefed on the campaign. Maybe Donald Trump was briefed, but at that point he was receiving intelligence briefings. But this idea that they didn't know until 10 days beforehand was kind of, there was always an Iranian threat on Donald Trump ever since he dropped that bomb and killed the Iranian General Soleimani in early 2020. So that existed, but this was an acute threat. This was somebody that the FBI was pursuing and then did arrest the day before the rally. So the fact that some people on the ground did know and were briefed, were read into that, and some people didn't, is a problem that a lot of these agents are citing to sort of push back on the discipline. There's people who say that's ridiculous because there was always an Iranian threat. And wouldn't you, by deductive reasoning, say, okay, counter snipers are suddenly here for the first time at an event? Doesn't that mean the threat's got to be heightened? So, what I blame the top brass though for is the next day after they were briefed, they had an event in Doral, Florida. Trump did, and there were no counter snipers there, so they didn't scramble enough. The threat didn't make them scramble enough to put counter snipers. It didn't make them scramble enough to allow a counter surveillance unit, which is roving groups of agents that are designed and focused on mitigating threats in the crowd. They relied on the local law enforcement to find Thomas Crooks. And, that is a leadership issue. And right now, Cheadle did resign. But right now, Ron Rowe just took a job with the Chertoff Group, which it's a very lucrative job. He advertised it. He promoted himself on LinkedIn. And so he's sitting pretty. And I'm told that Cheadle has sitting on at least 10 million of her net worth, based in part from PepsiCo, from her job that Jill Biden helped her get. So who is taking the fall here? It's junior agents and the Pittsburgh field office, but it's just a slap on the wrist, really no accountability. Basically, I don't think the agents that I've talked to that are incensed over these failures, the senior agents and the retired agents, they just can't believe that this is what we're dealing with, and that they argue that Helen Comparatori absolutely deserves better.
She deserves better. It sounds like the Trump administration, who's now in charge, has actually maybe in some ways issued more accountability for some of the failures, because part of what you're reporting also, and again, there's so much here, and just to go back to what you said earlier, because you got to remember, people that are listening to this, you are so good. You've been following this for so long. So you talk about Kim Cheadle and Ron Rowe. Those are the two people who previously then headed up the Secret Service detail, and they both left. So we're now on our third head of the Secret Service since the last year in terms of the assassination attempt. Both those people, it sounds like, have been able to cash in a real way. And you've got these low-level agents being suspended for pay, one of whom, the person who was suspended the longest. I guess tell us about her and how she was singled. What do we know about this agent who's received the longest suspension in the wake of the July 13th shooting, and why was she singled out by Donald Trump himself at a party?
Yeah. So her name is Mia Soti Perez. She is an inexperienced agent in terms of the entire detail. She only had 3.5 years, 3.5 years on the detail, in the Secret Service, and just a year or 2 years on the detail itself. Never had been in charge of a big event like this, security, and then you overlap the Iranian threat, and it's just ridiculous that they put this inexperienced agent in this position set up to fail. That being said, is they say, oh, she wasn't hand selected. It was her rotation came up, and everybody has to learn at some point. Well, that's been thrown out since this happened. The Secret Service has totally overhauled that thinking and that protocol. They now are saying, based on the congressional recommendations, that logical. Let's follow logic. Let's put experienced agents in charge of difficult, complex rallies like Butler, instead of letting an inexperienced agent take the fall. And then not the Christmas party. You want me to go into the Christmas party? Donald Trump was at Mar-a-Lago with his detail last December, and he talked to the crowd. It was obviously after an extremely turbulent period. And he said, this Mia Soto Perez, he didn't name her, but he said, you can see that there's one agent who's no longer here, who's no longer among us, and she's not welcome here. In fact, don't get her anywhere near me. This is what was conveyed. And that agent is the one that had the most culpability in terms of her not doing her job. But she had supervisors too that also just skated, and they were supposed to provide the layers of oversight that her inexperience lacked.
Have you ever heard of that before? Have you ever heard of, you've been following and covering the Secret Service for a long time, have you ever heard of a principal who's being protected reacting that way? I mean, of course, it's very unusual for someone to physically be shot, as Donald Trump was, but have you ever heard of somebody singling out an agent that way, as Donald Trump did?
No, I haven't. Usually they are try to protective of their agents because obviously their lives depend on it. Uh, he also, though, I thought that this was funny. I reported this last year. Ron Rowe, the acting director at the time that Secretary Mayorkas, DH Secretary Mayorkas appointed. Now you can say he was hand selected by Mayorkas, who's obviously problematic in terms of keeping our borders safe, and his whole record on that is.
Yeah, why is Mayorkas in charge of keeping anything safe? It's a great question, and it's not a great track record that way.
Absolutely not. So he's hand selected Ron Rowe, who was Cheadle's number two. He was part of they were all part of the big cabal there, and they were basically trying to keep the information from getting out. But Donald Trump last year, Ron Rowe was trying to get a meeting with Donald Trump, and he went down to Florida because he wasn't getting any traction trying to get this meeting. And he was like hovering around Mar-a-Lago, and Donald Trump would not meet with him after his testimony before Congress. There was a big moment with Representative Pat Fallon, where he had this, screaming match over whether he was trying to look good on 9/11 anniversary and position himself in front of other agents just for the optics. So there's a lot of, Donald Trump doesn't mince words, and this was a private moment that he had. And I can imagine his level of frustration with this young woman who had a reputation for a partier, had complaints against her about posting selfies on Instagram from her assignments, including Mar-a-Lago. Can you imagine if you're Donald Trump and you find out that that's who was protecting you at Butler? I mean, I would be insane.
Yeah, imagine. Well, and it's interesting to contrast Donald Trump's reaction in those moments that you're sharing with the way he reacted in real time on the stage in Butler, Pennsylvania, in which he appeared to be quite determined and fierce and resilient. And of course, he gets up. He was composed. It's unbelievable, and obviously he was able to use this moment and the fact that he survived this assassination attempt to profound political benefit. I think you could say it's one of the things that has helped propel him back into the White House. So in some ways, the Secret Service's failure has benefited him, but you certainly cannot blame him for being frustrated and upset with the more you learn about just how much those failures seemed avoidable and were chalked up to what we have called targeted incompetence, and we will stop short of saying that the Secret Service intentionally allowed conditions that would make an assassination of this political opponent of the president at the time more possible or probable, but there are data points that would allow one to draw that conclusion if you wanted to. And I think that that's unfortunately what continues to be a theme as the story comes out. And not the least of which comes down to like how little we know about and how little attention we pay to the person who actually firing the shots. And I know your focus has been more on the Secret Service and less on Thomas Crooks, but just going back and looking at, because you've said the Secret Service is one of those things that people don't really pay much attention to until something like this happens, and now all of a sudden everyone's like, we're all over it. And so there's stuff that I think has been reported in the last year that we've missed, and people have made the point, how come we don't know this much about this Thomas Crooks person? We knew so much about the guy that took a shot at the United Healthcare CEO almost instantly, but the person who took a shot at the actual president of the United States has remained a mystery. A private investigator that was hired to look into the case by a client told the New York Post in February that his team of investigators had conducting geofencing analysis of electronic devices that did not belong to Crooks, but were found with him in his home and other locations. His quote that he gave the New York Post in February, Susan, is, "We don't think he acted alone. This took a lot of coordination. In my view, Crooks was handled by more than one individual, and he was used for this." Is that a narrative that the Secret Service is aware of? I mean, I guess what do you feel like the Secret Service's perspective is on this person? Is it was, hey, we're this really expensive, complicated federal agency, and we just were foiled by one 20-year-old kid who had a good SAT score? Or do you think that there's an openness to the idea that it was more coordinated than that?
Well, the Secret Service in the aftermath, their job is to go and find these people that are plotting against the president and others, the other protectees. But in the aftermath, it's not their job. So they didn't spend a lot of time investigating Thomas Crooks. That was the FBI in the aftermath. But yeah, it's
Hmm.
incredibly embarrassing. And I still want to know, and I think Senator Johnson, since he subpoenaed this on Friday, I don't know why he waited until Friday, but he wants to know what was in those encrypted apps. They were foreign. They weren't, they were not like Signal, like an American based encrypted app that we all now notoriously are aware of Signal. It's, and we all use it, but why? I don't get this encrypted apps overseas. And Jonathan Solomon was the one who first reported that. We still don't have answers to that. We have his emails showing that he was, upwardly, there was upward mobility with him. He was trying to go, seemed like he was a smart guy, was going to majoring in engineering in a community college, was trying to get to a 4-year college. His emails seemed pretty, bland. His online post, I guess he was on Gab. That's the one that I've seen, the only social media that I've seen. Is he was talking about both Joe Biden and Donald Trump and immigration policy, but nothing completely targeted on Donald Trump.
Right.
So yeah, we
But
need.
the fact that we know so little itself seems to be quite significant. And to your point, just so you talked about Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, on Friday subpoenaed Kash Patel for records relating to Crooks. He's looking for security footage that's obtained from his movements before the shooting.
Yep.
There's forensic reports about the assassination attempt, and then also related documents related to social media, email accounts, search history, call logs. The fact that we don't have that hasn't been comprehensively reported a year after the fact seems, to me, this is, again, you worked in and around this stuff, and it's not the Secret Service per se, but it seems like we should be more knowledgeable of this person, does it not?
Absolutely, it does. And now his family has hired a white shoe law firm, a very, expensive one, prestigious one. And so, how did they get the money for that? It's very curious. They basically, the family is locked down. The CBS News did a good report last week, and they talked to some of the neighbors, and he had a good reputation. They were saying that, if he's a really smart kid, and he worked at a nursing home. He was trying to better himself, and all of a sudden he turned. What was that all about? And why did these foreign apps have any? What did they have to do with this? And why don't we have the text on those foreign
So
apps? Yeah.
why don't we have them? That's a great question. And why don't we know? And this is the thing that came out in the Washington Post last week. Thomas Crooks was one of 4 people who were each wearing distinctly colored shirts that remained around this building, the American Glass building, which is where the shots came from the roof. The business owner saw 4 people hanging out there, and he told, even though the business was closed, and they were all told to leave. And so the person in the gray shirt, who was later identified as Crooks, that was flagged by a local law enforcement official, said, just keep an eye on him, let me know what's going on. And then 20 minutes before Donald Trump takes the stage, another local police officer is saying they see Crooks lurking around the building. There's just so many questions that we still don't have answers to as to why this person was allowed to remain in the area. They weren't handled by a more severe law enforcement presence. It just remains quite troubling. I guess, like, as you reflect back on, we're a year after this, and you've been inside, you've talked to sources within the Secret Service, you've done so much work on this. What is the biggest thing you feel like we still don't know?
Yeah. We still don't know what his motive is. This is ridiculous. Rand Paul staffers asked the FBI, and that this is how their report concludes, that they said they had a glimpse of cooperation with the FBI initially in February in an initial meeting, because they didn't get anywhere with the previous FBI under the Biden administration. But they thought, new administration, Trump, Republican-based, Trump-based administration. But it said, ever since then, it has been stonewalling, and there's been no cooperation. So I know that Dan Bongino and Kash Patel have been drinking through a fire hose. They're getting left and right on the Epstein files. But now you have some criticism from Rand Paul on their cooperation with the Secret Service investigation as well.
Yeah, it's just stunning to think about the way that all the different federal agencies have reacted to this in the wake of it. And to compare it, Susan, we'll kind of end here. This is obviously the first major assassination attempt of a U.S. politician since Ronald Reagan. And so, in April of 2021, it was the 40th anniversary of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. And if you go to the Secret Service website, they address this in a very different way than I think the Secret Service is dealing with the aftermath of the Trump assassination. Just so for people that are less familiar with it, the person who attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan, John Hinckley, fired 6 shots. One hit the White House press secretary, James Brady, in the head. Another one hit a local police officer in the neck. Special Agent Tim McCarthy, who was part of the Secret Service detail, was hit in the abdomen as he turned to shield the president. 2 other shots ricocheted off the presidential limousine. But as they detail in the Secret Service accounting of this, within seconds of the first shot being fired, Special Agent Dennis McCarthy dove across the street, landed on the would-be assassin as the presidential limousine departed the scene. And the quote is that while the events of that afternoon, now 40 years removed, may begin to fade from the minds of most Americans, it's worth recalling and acknowledging that the heroic response of the highly trained agents who acted swiftly and with purpose to fulfill their sworn duty to secure their protectee. The Secret Service, I think it's fair to say, Susan, is looking at what happened a year ago in a very different way. Is that your sense? Do they look back on it with any semblance of the pride that you hear in that account of the Reagan assassination attempt? Or is it just, we messed up and we are sorry?
Yeah, the latter. And I think that, you have a much more extensive media presence now. You have an expectation of far more transparency. And honestly, they got Corey Comparatori, an innocent rally-goer, killed. This is a civilian, and it goes to the heart of our democracy, not just continuity of government, but the heart of our democracy, that somebody has to go to a rally now, has to consider that they could get killed because they don't trust the Secret Service to do their job. So I think that changes the whole perspective on it, because that incident with Reagan just involved civil servants and the president, not just, but that it was traumatic, obviously, and a gripping moment and just downright scary. But it was happening outside of the Hilton in Washington, D.C., not at a rally, a basic element of democracy, of our democratic process. So that's what I think is the difference there.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great perspective, and it's a great way to kind of conclude this. It's an affront to our democracy, partly because of the failures of the Secret Service. We know more about those failures because of your reporting, Susan, and so we just want to thank you for the work you've done. It's been a year. You continue to not let this go, and I think we applaud the fact that finally you've got members of the United States Senate and Chuck Grassley and Rand Paul and Ron Johnson are kind of following your lead, I think it's fair to say, and demanding answers as you have been for some time. So we thank you for your reporting. We can't wait to continue to follow it and see what else we need to know about the way that the federal government failed, I think, the country, the people at that rally, and Donald Trump in a very real and obviously consequential way. So thank you for that. And we also want to just take time to say thank you to the people listening or watching this program. We know you have a lot of different options and choices to where you get your content. And so, we appreciate the fact that the numbers continue to increase. We appreciate all the kind feedback we get. Continue to please leave that. We love your comments on whatever the podcast platform you're using, whether it's YouTube or Spotify or iHeart or anything else. And feel free to always reach out to us on social media. We love to engage with you. We try to give you information on this program that you can't get anywhere else. And so we'll continue to try to do that here. So Peter Schweizer's out. He'll be back next week. I'm Eric Eggers. Thank you very much for listening to The Drill Down. Until next time.